Alright, continuing from where we left off in the last video, we had loaded in our dynamic pivot script into our custom shelf, and now let's click on that to see what it does. So that's going to activate that script, and now we get the brick snapping back. Now we don't really want it to snap back on frame 2 because that's going to get rid of the animation that we had created there. So I'm just going to press Z to make sure that I don't do that on frame 2, but I will pop over to frame 3 now. And now I can hit dynamic pivot, right? Everything kind of snaps back to where it was. And I'm going to move my my translate control over here and bring that down. And as I continue animating here, what I need to agree on is what is it that I'm going to rotate. So the major orient control, the big capsule shaped thing around the brick, is really, for the purposes of this animation, used only when we were first setting up the initial rotation of how the brick was positioned. For all the other little rotations that we do, it's going to be coming down to our funny shaped control, the brick pivot control, which is our dynamic pivot. So make sure that when you're rotating from this control. It's going to be very important, as you'll see here. So I'm going to pop in, make sure I'm in object mode, there we go, and I'm going to start rotating this a bit more as well. So grab that down there, move down a little bit more. And I'm not sure if this is exactly the right amount of rotation, but I'll go in and I'll make sure to turn my auto key back on. I'll just make sure to set a key there on all of my controls. I clicked on the brick controls. And now if I compare before and after, I could say that this could possibly start to rotate a little bit more, maybe just a little bit. Just comparing the before and after. In fact, it actually might be down a little bit more as well. Let's make sure I grab the right control. Move that down a little bit more. Maybe rotate this a little bit, like that. Okay, that's probably looking pretty good. Again, grab everything, hit S. Okay, so what's the next frame that I need to worry about? Well, just in terms of setting something up like this is kind of like a bouncing ball assignment in the sense that we have the brick falling, and then the next thing that we're going to have it collide with is going to be our table ledge. So we're going to come over to frame 4, get to our next frame. I'm going to grab my translate control, the big arrow, and we're going to bring this guy down quite a bit. Going to come down, and it's also going to pop on over a bit more as well because there is a bit of a forward momentum going on there. I'm going to grab my brick pivot control and start to rotate that. And the amount of rotation is slightly arbitrary. Like I could have the brick land 90 degrees flat onto this surface here, but that might not be that interesting. In fact, because this particular animation requires that the brick hits one surface and then hits another surface, we kind of need it to be a bit off balance. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of make the brick slightly off balance here, so it's going to come down and hit this edge. Now bring this down here, and then we just got to decide how we're going to make sure that we know that it's contacted with the actual countertop here. Just sort of how do we eyeball that? Well, I could sneak in here and just have a look. And actually I can see, in fact, if I kind of come to the opposite side of my ledge here, that there is a little bit of the brick sticking through, which is probably fine. It's not going to be noticeable from our camera distance. And that's fine. I could also pop on over into a side view, for instance, and take a look at it that way, or a front view, right? Just kind of get an idea of how well that's sitting within that geometry there, right? And all right, so that should be fine. Now, grab all of my keys again and just say S. Now, do I know that this is sitting exactly in the right position? Not necessarily. This is going to come down to eyeballing it a bit. In fact, you can see sometimes these different wall panels kind of get in the way of being able to see things very well. I could put them on their own layer, but I can probably get by just watching it from up here. So brick starts there, pops out a little bit, moves forward a little bit, and lands there. What that's telling me, because of the amount of forward motion here, I might even push that back a little bit. Grab that there, pull that back just a little bit. There we go. And then I might pull this forward just a little bit as well. So just to kind of make sure that the motion forward looks right. All right. Now, with that, let's go in and create our next rotation. So the very first thing that I need to do is to go in and go to my next frame and press the dynamic pivot command again. But we're going to run into an issue here. Namely, where was the brick located? If I try to go in and replicate that rotation here, and then go in and try to move my dynamic pivot downward to match the contact point, I'm going to run into that issue of like the brick doesn't really follow along correctly. So I don't want that to happen. What I need to do, just undoing here a little bit, is to have some way of keeping track of where the edge is here that's touching my countertop. And I can click on my brick, and I can click on, if I go right click on the brick and go to edge mode, on the brick, not on the table, I can select an edge, right? So I can kind of agree on it's that particular edge that I want to follow, for instance. But I need something that's going to go in there and give me the opportunity to keep track of the location and the rotation of the brick at that point. So how do I go about that? Well, fortunately, I have a script, not one that I wrote, and I do find a lot of these scripts online. Basically, I go to highend3d.com, and there's a great repository of scripts there. And I found this one, which is also included with the project files, which is actually a MEL script. It's a script written in the Maya embedded language as opposed to Python, and I have just all of a sudden somehow docked my script editor up there, so we don't really want to do that. So the previous script that we had loaded in was a Python script written in the Python language. Now we need to go over into the MEL tab and load in a script that is written in the MEL language. They're not the same, although you can technically pass some MEL commands into Python, but you can't go backwards. So to find this script, it's going to go to File, Load Script, and I'm going to go find this on in my files. And this one is called lock on lock, right? Basically, it stands for locator on location .mel. That's how you know it's a MEL script. We'll click Open. All right, and so this script is written by Martin Kulig, who has provided his information here. And that's one way, of course, if you're writing a script to make sure that you get proper credit for it. And again, I'm not really going to go in and explain what this does in terms of the actual coding, because you can see that there's quite a bit of code that goes on here for what appears to be a relatively simple operation. However, I will show you what it does. So what we need to do is I'm going to select the whole thing, and I'm going to go back up here into Save Script to Shelf again. And we're going to call this something like lock, just call it lock on, something like that. Doesn't really matter. All right, there it is, lock on. The icon's a little bit different. That's a Python icon. That's a MEL icon, basically. Now, in order for this to work, what we need to do is to select something in our scene. It could be an object, it could be a component like an edge, right? And whatever we have selected there when we press this button, if we just go through the default settings here and press Start, this script creates a locator, which is an object that in your Maya scene that is not renderable, but it does provide an X, Y, and Z location and rotation for you to be able to see the location of something. That's why it's called a locator. All right, and if I went to the foreview there, you might be able to better see, there we go, that locator right there, that crosshair. And you can see that it's actually not only inherited the center point of that line, of that edge, but it's also inherited the rotation, that custom rotation that we have there. So this is going to be really valuable to us as we try to replicate the position and rotation that we had in this frame. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go in and say we're going to change our dynamic pivot back to its original default values. And now I want that dynamic pivot, of course, to exist down at the bottom right corner. So what I want to do is go in and first move my object to match the location of that locator. So I want that corner edge to match it, I should say. So if I go in here, and this is another one of those situations where I'm going to have to be really zoomed in one view, and then I'm going to have to, in another view, like this one here, use the gizmo to kind of bring it down. So I'm looking over here in the front view while I am dragging down in the side view. Right? And as I said, if you find that the amount of dragging that you are doing is going a little bit too fast, you can make the gizmo bigger or smaller by using the plus or minus keys on your keyboard. The bigger the locator, or sorry, the bigger the gizmo, the sort of more delicate it allows you to move something around. Now, I don't want to move it in the side view. I need to move it here in the front view. So I'm actually going to do that here from the top. All right, so that's moving really quite a large amount there. It's going to zoom in a little bit more here. Also, the closer you are to something in terms of being zoomed in, the more delicate the adjustments will be as well. So what we did originally was to match up an edge that basically corresponds with this point right here, which means I just need to bring this down ever so slightly more. I believe that's where that was. All right, something like that. And now that we have that point lined up there, we also need to bring in our pivot control to match up at that same location as well. So I'm going to bring that down, find the center point of that and bring that down. And then bring it over here. There we go. Now we can actually see it, which is a little bit more helpful. And just get that to match up right there. Okay, cool. Very good. Cool. So now with that done, we can actually rotate it out as well. So we want to go to our rotate control, and I can make that a bit smaller. That doesn't have to be so big. And I'm going to rotate it to match the amount of rotation that I see in the locator itself, which if I actually click on the locator, it tells me that there's a Z rotate of that much and a Y rotate of that much. That's actually probably not going to really help us. I was hoping that maybe we could copy that amount over, but perhaps not. So go back to the reason for that is because I'm only rotating in a single axis on the brick, whereas the locator was technically rotated in multiple axes. So we're just going to eyeball it as best we can, and that's no big deal. So there we go. All right, and so that looks like that's pretty darn close. Okay, so I'm going to click on everything on the brick and press S again, and now let's just compare before and after. Right, I would say that barring just a tiny push backwards, we are in the same location. There we go. That's probably the only thing we really needed to do. Yeah, so super close. This tiny amount of difference, probably never even noticeable. Okay, awesome. So what we've done basically is replicated the position of our our previous frame here, but with a different pivot location. All right, so now if I were to rotate from here, if I grab my click on the right thing. For some reason it's decided to stop responding to me. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly pause the video so that I can get this to start working again. Okay, no worries. There was just a little bit of an issue and I had to restart Maya, but our scene is exactly the same as it was just a moment ago. So what I'm doing now is saying, look, here's frame 4 and now frame 5. We're exactly in the same position. The brick came down and hit on frame 4, so we expect that on frame 5, it's going to come down and now go into our next key pose, which is going to be when it collides with the ledge here. So let's now go and grab our pivot control, and we're going to rotate this down until it's perfectly at a 90-degree angle to our ledge. And this is probably going to require a little bit of a front view to be able to better see. Right? Something like that is probably pretty good. Right? So it's only going to be really for one frame that it starts looking like this. Right? Because on the very next frame, at frame 6 now, we're going to shift the pivot to that location there. Cool. So let's say grab all of our controls and hit S, key it in, and confirm that everything is still working fine. There we go. Cool. All right, now frame 6. Let's go in and set that dynamic pivot back to where it was. We'll go ahead and rotate our brick out to a 90-degree angle to match what we had before. Now this is one that I'm starting to think, we might run into an issue while we do this. So I'm going to do a little bit of an experimentation while I am demoing this. You might want to just sort of sit back and watch and see if what I do works out. The reason why I say that is because I'm having to rotate the brick first, and I'm going to see if by repositioning that dynamic pivot, if it causes any real problems. So I'm going to set that to 90 degrees, and I'm going to move my brick down, and I'm going to try to match that same location that we had. All right. Now the only issue here is that it's not as easy to eyeball the location that we were previously at compared to this new location, because we're not on the edge of the brick where there's some geometry. You know, we're kind of that previous frame that we created, like this one right here. I can't just click on this brick and say, all right, there's a line that goes across right here on this brick for me to say that's exactly where the brick needs to line up. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of a back and forth between the frames to just make sure that we're kind of lining it up as closely as possible. But you know what? Actually, better than that. I can do you better than that. I lie. So I'm going to click on that previous locator that we had created. We don't need to match it up based on the location where this contacts here. What we need to do is match it up based on any particular location that we choose, because it's going to stay the same no matter what. So for instance, if I decide that I want to base it on the position of this edge right here, all right, and I press lock on, and we create our locator there. Then what I can do is come back down here on frame 6 and grab my arrow tool here. There we go. And from the front view, we're just going to move this forward until we actually match it up. Right, so I actually might need to pop over here into my top view to better see this. And there we go. There we are. And now we're going to take it down a little bit. All right, I'm going to turn off the visibility of cameras here real quick. Make that a little bit bigger. Zoom in a little bit more. All right. And just matching it up right about there. Very close. All right, so we've used that position there as a way to determine that that's actually matched up properly. And if I compare before and after, I say, well, that's pretty darn close. It's a slight difference in the rotation, but that's okay. All right. And now that means that this should be matching up properly as well. But one thing I do see here, and this is just me talking out loud while I'm animating, is if I compare before and after, notice how before the brick was up, and now, because it's like this totally 90-degree angle, it's down slightly. So I think that what we can do is we'll do, again, I'll grab my pivot control, and I'm going to rotate this ever so slightly. What was the rotation before? It was 90. Okay, so here was the previous rotation, 90.431. And that's what I'm going to replicate here, 90.431, 90.431. There we go. And now that I've done that, I'm going to go back and reposition the translate control to match based on that rotation, because that was slightly off. Now, what's going on here? So as I try to grab that translate control, right, we're starting to get some issues here. And I've noticed this happen before with the brick rig. Sometimes things seem to break if I start going back and forth between previous frames and next frames. So that's a little bit of an issue, obviously. But this was kind of an experimentation anyway. So just keeping that in mind, let us, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to select all of my control for the brick on frame 6, and I'm just going to right click on frame 6 and say delete. Not a big deal. Go back to frame 5. All right, frame 5 looked like this. And we'll go back to frame 6 now and say that dynamic pivot. And now that I do this, I'm going to just have a much better understanding of what I need to do. I was kind of playing around in that previous example. So now I know that the rotation here is 90.431 in Y. So let's start out with that. So we're going to type in 90.431. So automatically we get that rotated where we need it to be. We also know that that edge needs to match up to this locator here. So let's go ahead and do that. Right, so let's just start bringing that down closer there. And start pulling that up. Cool. So that's looking right. All right. Now, the big issue is making sure that we are able to still translate our brick to, translate the pivot of the brick to be right here on that edge. And will it let us do that? No. See, it's starting to do this weird thing. Okay. See, I don't mind making these mistakes as I'm doing the tutorial because these are likely to be things that you're going to run into. So you just got to kind of realize that as I'm doing these tutorials, sometimes I'm working through it, experimenting around, and if you just try to follow along and expect that everything I do is going to be the right thing, you're probably going to be disappointed. But I want to run into mistakes because I know that you're going to run into them as well, and I want to show you how to solve them when we do run into them. So let's go ahead and undo a little bit here and think about how we might try to do exactly those same things that we just did, but before we move anything, or sorry, I should say, before we rotate anything on the brick pivot control, we need to be able to get it somehow to match up to the location right here that corresponds to where it needs to be once it rotates. An interesting issue, isn't it? So what I'm going to do, just because we have this sort of cliffhanger here, I'm just going to pause the video now, and I'm going to, actually I say I'll stop the video now, and we're going to continue on with this same issue in the next video.